I never considered myself a perfect mother, and I always knew I wouldn't be one. At the age of 18, I found myself pregnant after just one date with a guy named Gabriel, who happened to be the school's resident bad boy. When I broke the news to him, he promptly changed schools, leaving me with no way to reach him. He blocked my calls and messages, making it clear that I was on my own. My religious beliefs ruled out the option of abortion, so I braved the ridicule at school, teachers using me as an example, and endured 9 months of physical discomfort. Finally, my son was born, and I held him in my arms without even having a driver's license at the time. Filled with fear and uncertainty, I gave him the name Andrew, and from that moment on, it was just him and me against the world. My parents kicked me out, leaving me to fend for myself. Despite the overwhelming fear, I managed to build a life for us. I obtained my GED and secured a job. It's true that I worked double shifts at 2 different fast food restaurants, and the constant smell of grease clung to me like a shadow. It seemed like no man would come within 500 feet of me, but I had a 2-bedroom apartment, and I was somebody. Things took a turn for the worse when Andrew was around 6 years old. He began to experience severe vomiting episodes, sometimes lasting for a week at a time. Concerned, I took him to the doctor, and after a series of tests, they started suspecting it might be cancer. My heart pounded with fear as I faced the daunting challenge of my son's health problems. He underwent various surgeries and required a stomach tube due to his underlying health issues. Each day was a battle, and I feared for his life. Amidst the chaos, I found myself losing my temper, and I'm not proud to admit that I yelled at him. I was exhausted and overworked, trying to explain to him that I had to work to provide for both of us. Whenever I had to leave for work or class, Andrew would throw tantrums, making it even harder for me. On one particular day, when the babysitter arrived at our door, I left in frustration. I just couldn't handle the situation any longer. About 30 minutes later, the babysitter called me in a panic, saying, "Andrew's gone." I couldn't comprehend what she meant and asked her to clarify. I assumed he might be hiding somewhere in the house or in his playhouse due to our earlier argument. However, when I returned home, it became painfully evident that he was nowhere to be found. His clothes were gone, and he had taken his favorite stuffed animal. My son had disappeared, and panic set in. The following hours were a blur of tears and interactions with the police, who questioned both the babysitter and me about what had transpired. There were no answers to be found. As the police began questioning our neighbors, things took a troubling turn for me. It came to light that they had heard me yelling at Andrew that day, placing me at the top of the list of police suspects. My sole desire was for them to find my missing child, but with each passing day, hope dwindled. The police presence at my home became a daily occurrence, and I felt like I was slowly losing my sanity. Then, at 4 a.m., a phone call brought unexpected relief. Andrew had been found. I raced to the police station with tears of relief in my eyes. The police informed me that he had been discovered wandering outside the station, disoriented and in tears. He had no recollection of where he had come from or what had occurred, but he still knew his own name. I rushed in to see my son, but something felt terribly wrong. Though he looked almost identical to my Andrew, there was something off about him, as if he were a counterfeit version. He had the same smile, the same face, the same build, but his eyes were different, not those of my son. What should have been a joyous reunion was marred by a deep sense of unease. When the boy rushed up to me, wrapping his arms around me and calling me mommy, my heart swelled with emotion. Maybe, just maybe, it was my son. Tearfully, I hugged him back, my doubts momentarily overshadowed. However, as I left to speak with the detectives, the child began to cry and question where I was going. It was a difficult decision to make, but I couldn't ignore the nagging doubts. When I explained to the detectives that I didn't believe the boy was my son, their reactions were far from understanding. They rolled their eyes and questioned his absence, insinuating that I might have done something to him. It felt as if I were being accused of either harming my own child or attempting to abandon him. Grateful for their efforts, I decided to take the child with me and left the police station. Throughout the journey back home, I attempted to calm my racing thoughts, but every time I glanced in the rearview mirror, the child's eyes met mine, intensifying my unease. I resolved to play along and engaged in a conversation with him, inquiring about where he had been and what had happened to him. He responded, I was away for a while, but I'm back now, Mommy," and his voice sounded strangely different. That night, I followed our usual routine, putting him to bed and reading his favorite bedtime story. My mind was in turmoil. Was I losing my sanity? Could it truly be my son? As the night wore on, I eventually drifted into sleep. However, when I awoke, I found the boy standing in the doorway, silently watching me. Alarmed, I asked him what was wrong, and he requested to sleep in my bed. Despite my unease, I allowed him to join me, but my heart raced throughout the night. My son was back, so why couldn't I find comfort? What was wrong with me? Perhaps the trauma of his disappearance had unsettled me. I desperately wished I could just relax and enjoy his return. However, as morning broke, my growing sense of unease was undeniable. Upon entering my bedroom, I discovered that the entire left side of my bed, including the pillow and covers, had been torn to shreds. Bewildered, I went outside and found Andrew sleeping soundly in his own bed. He acted as if he had no knowledge of what I was talking about, deepening my confusion and fear. He insisted that he had never been in that room, deepening my sense of unease. As Andrew returned to school, I began receiving constant calls from his teacher, reporting his aggressive behavior towards classmates, including an incident where he had thrown a stapler. What troubled me even more was the revelation that Andrew was struggling with reading and writing. This was perplexing since my son had always been a creative writer, crafting little books and stories before his disappearance. At home, I confronted another unsettling pattern: Andrew standing silently in my doorway every night. His eating habits had also taken a bizarre turn, as he would only consume cereal and milk, despite being allergic to milk from a young age. When I confided in friends about these eerie changes, they dismissed my concerns, urging me to be grateful for having my son back. Each time I questioned whether he was truly my son, I was met with eye rolls and disbelief. My distress intensified when I discovered that Andrew had been drawing strange symbols all over his bedroom walls. When I implored him to stop, he responded with violence, assaulting me. I couldn't help but wonder if my child was somehow possessed or influenced by sinister forces. One day, as we visited a park, I happened to glance across the street and was convinced I saw my real Andrew playing in a nearby yard. Overwhelmed with hope and panic, I sprinted down the street to reach him, but by the time I arrived, the boy had vanished, leaving me with a growing sense of dread and confusion. I could no longer bear the uncertainty. One night, I stealthily waited in the hallway for Andrew to fall asleep. Once he was in a deep slumber, I cautiously entered the bedroom. He had a scar from a feeding tube surgery years ago, and I knew this scar would reveal the truth. As I lifted his shirt to inspect, I was met with an unsettling discovery. There was no scar to be found. It was as I had suspected all along. This child was not my son. An involuntary gasp escaped my lips, and the imposter stirred in his bed. Unable to contain my anguish any longer, I began to scream, demanding to know where my real son was and how this child had come into our lives. In between sobs, he confessed that a man had taken him from an orphanage and instructed him on what to do. He revealed that he didn't want to cut the pillows or wake me, but the man had threatened to send him back to the orphanage if he didn't obey. My heart ached for this innocent boy who had effectively been blackmailed. He informed me that his true name was Dylan. Determined to uncover the identity of the man behind this twisted plot, I asked Dylan if he knew the location of the man's house. He nodded and assured me he could lead the way. We embarked on a drive through town until we reached a modest cottage. Instructing Dylan to remain in the car, I felt the urgency to investigate the house without delay. It suddenly struck me that this cottage was eerily familiar. It was the very same place where I had glimpsed a boy playing earlier. Panicked but resolute, I contacted the police to report a kidnapped child. However, I couldn't afford to wait idly by, fearing for Andrew's safety. With a pounding heart, I pounded on the door. To my horror, the person who appeared on the other side was none other than Gabriel, Andrew's father. It all began to make twisted sense, and through the open door, I could see Andrew sitting on the couch. I pushed Gabriel aside and rushed to Andrew, cradling him in my arms as I ignored Gabriel's furious screams, accusing me of keeping him away from his child. At the police station, the truth finally came to light. Gabriel had visited our home, convinced Andrew that he was his father, and asked him to go with him. Andrew, feeling upset due to my prolonged absence and frustration from our argument, decided to accompany him. As the search for Andrew gained widespread media attention, Gabriel realized he couldn't evade the authorities for much longer. In a desperate attempt, he scoured every adoption agency in the area until he found Dylan. He coerced Dylan into playing along, sending him to the police station to impersonate my son. Upon reflection, I offered Andrew a heartfelt apology for not being there when he needed me most. I explained that none of this was his fault and that I had been working tirelessly to provide for us. I assured him that I would redouble my efforts to protect him and be a better mother. It was during this time that I also recognized the plight of Dylan, who suddenly had no home. This young boy had experienced life in an orphanage, endured adoption, and suffered emotional abuse. It was unthinkable to send him back to such circumstances. Driven by compassion, I worked closely with the police and the adoption agency to gain approval to care for Dylan. As I pursued my nursing career, I became increasingly available to provide the love and attention my sons so rightfully deserved. Over time, our situation improved, and I couldn't help but feel relieved that Gabriel had never been a part of my son's upbringing. Not only was he a terrible person, but he had also displayed a shocking lack of intelligence in thinking his plan would succeed.